A young man broke into the house, insulted and murdered his wife who was at home, and threw their 11-month-old child into a garbage bag and threw it on the floor until the child died. The body of the 11-month-old child was covered in bruises and blood clots, with twisted limbs and a severely deformed head. The forensic doctor shed tears when he saw the scene. The family's only thought was that the murderer should pay with his own life. Chapter 1. We received a call from the police on the evening of the incident. The scene was an apartment building with 2 apartments on each floor, connected by a staircase in the apartment complex in this district. The homeowner, Mr. Chen Ken, lost control. He roared and cried at the scene and almost fainted. The victims were his wife and daughter. His wife was 25 years old, named Duong Hu, and his daughter was less than a year old, named Tran Trang. The happy family fell into hell because of a beast. We quickly conducted a survey of the scene and found the body of Yang Hui lying crookedly on the bed. From the bruises on her neck, we could preliminarily conclude that she had been strangled to death. There were varying degrees of injuries on her forehead, cheeks, and the corners of her mouth, clearly indicating that she had been brutally assaulted and beaten. The situation was truly heartbreaking. What was worse was that the baby's room was right next door. When we entered, a black garbage bag was lying quietly in the corner. The bag was torn and blood was seeping onto the floor. The baby's body had been taken out of the garbage bag by the father and placed neatly in the crib. It looked like the baby was sleeping. The baby was 11 months old, soft and chubby. Because of this physical characteristic, after being beaten hard, the baby's body was severely damaged. The baby's body was covered with bruises and blood. Not a single piece of skin was intact. There was a dent in the back of the head, bleeding, possibly from hitting the corner of the door. The baby's face was completely disfigured, partly due to the baby's strangled cries, partly due to the fact that his face had hit the floor. The baby's neck was broken, because when the forensic doctor gently held the baby and lifted him up, his head was tilted back more than 90 degrees. The baby's small arms were definitely broken from the shock. The 2 tiny hands were like 2 soft towels. It was hard to imagine how someone could torture a child so brutally. None of us could bear the sight, let alone the father, who was on the verge of a mental breakdown. Perhaps putting the baby in the crib was his last gentle act. We immediately reported the situation at the scene. The leaders also took it very seriously and considered it a top investigative task. But in reality, the investigation process was not too complicated. In addition to the physical evidence, we also conducted a comprehensive investigation of the scene and collected evidence. But even the investigators found this process very painful. In the house, a warm family photo of 3 people hung on the living room wall. At that time, Trang was only about 2 or 3 months old, lying in her mother's arms and smiling very sweetly. Not only the baby, but also the parents smiled happily. In addition, there were wedding photos on the TV cabinet, dolls on the sofa, all showing the warmth of this house. But all of them were gone. The only survivor in the family collapsed to the point of having to be hospitalized and given sedatives. During the investigation, we discovered many strange shoe prints, fingerprints, and hair in the house. The perpetrator apparently did not expect to be discovered. Since the building did not have a surveillance system, we could only identify the suspect's face and confirm his identity through the security cameras downstairs. The suspect is Zhang Zhiquan, 19 years old, 1m73 tall, a senior in high school in the district. Normally, he should not be in high school at this age, but this is not related to the case, so let's not mention it for now. He also has a criminal record. His mother died early. He lives in a single-parent family, but his father, Jian Tao, is the boss of the largest real estate group in the city. Since Zhang Zhiquan was an adult, we did not need to notify his parents before arresting him. So, we acted quickly that night and arrested Zhang Zhiquan. When he was arrested, he was still eating with some classmates at a barbecue restaurant near the school, as if the brutal case that day had nothing to do with him. Before getting into the police car, he made a fuss, saying he didn't understand what was going on and why he was arrested. When he got into the police car, he started crying. He cried so much that he could barely stand. At that time, the police car didn't have a surveillance camera, and the colleagues in the car had all been at the crime scene since the evening. No one knew what happened in the car, but they could all guarantee that nothing was unusual. After returning to the investigation team, Captain Zhou announced that this case must be handled immediately that night. He would contact various departments to work through the night to complete the chain of evidence. We knew that this was to prevent the suspect's father, Jian Tao, from using his power and assets to interfere with the investigation. We also quickly collected Zhang Zhiquan's hair sample and fingerprints to send for verification. The fingerprint comparison results were available immediately and matched the fingerprints left at the scene. The DNA results from the hair sample took more time. That night, Lao Su and I were responsible for interrogating the suspect. At first, he cried and asked to see his father, saying that he had been beaten, that this was forced confession, that he was innocent and that we had arrested the wrong person. Without any remorse, we showed the evidence from the surveillance video and fingerprint comparison on the table and shouted at him. There is a chance of leniency now if you confess. If you continue to make excuses, you will die even if you cannot see your father. At that moment, Zhang Zhiquan realized the seriousness of the matter. Of course, it didn't matter whether he confessed or not. He could still be convicted even if he didn't confess. But we also had the responsibility to find out the whole truth. For example, did he know Yang Hui? Why was Yang Hui chosen as the target? After all, there was a child in the house. This crime did not target just one victim, but in most rape cases, the victim is usually a woman living alone. In addition, if it was just a break-in to rape, why kill the wife? Even cruelly using such a cruel method to kill an 11-month-old baby? Zhang Zhiquan's testimony made me realize how terrible the degeneration of human beings can be. Some people may no longer be considered human. According to Zhang Zhiquan's testimony, he did not know the victim's family at all. At noon on the day of the incident, Zhang Zhiquan had just woken up and was preparing to go to the internet cafe. At that time, he saw Yang Hui and her daughter pushing a shopping cart back from shopping. Yang Hui was only 25 years old, young and beautiful. Zhang Zhiquan said that at that time he had a desire. I want to try the feeling with a young woman. Those were his words. So he pretended to be interested in the lovely nakedness and proceeded to tease the child. As a first-time parent, it is easy to trust those who love your child, especially in a small residential area where there are not many strangers. Zhang Zhiquan successfully chatted with Yang Hui and learned that she was often home alone to take care of the children, and that her husband was not at home during work hours. Later, when Yang Hui had bought some vegetables and daily necessities, he offered to help her carry the things. Perhaps because she thought that pushing the cart upstairs was inconvenient, and the cart could also be folded, she agreed. Since she had already bought the goods and supplies, she did not have enough hands to carry them, so she accepted Zhang Zhiquan's offer to help, and that was why he was able to enter her house so easily. I helped her carry the things back and enter the house. When I entered, I locked the front door, then I took out a knife and threatened her to go into the room, otherwise I would kill her daughter. From then on, she would do anything I asked her to do. Then why did you kill her if she complied with my request? She resisted. When I asked her to lie down on the bed, she resisted. It was all her fault. If she hadn't resisted, would I have hit her? I was also afraid that people outside would hear. When I woke up, I had already strangled her to death. It was all her fault, he said. Anyone who heard this couldn't contain their anger. But we still tried to stay calm because the interrogation room had a surveillance camera. What about the baby? Why did you want to kill it? It cried forever, who could bear it? I was panicking because that woman was dead. I just threw it into the trash bag, but it still cried, so I threw it a few more times until it was quiet and left. He could describe everything in such an emotionless tone. 2 lives, a mother and a daughter, they could have had a happy life and a bright future. He didn't even think that he did anything wrong. With no other choice, Lao Zhu and I quickly completed the record, following all the regulations. Immediately after that, we continued to work overtime to complete the written documents and prepare the most solid evidence chain. Chief Chu also invited colleagues from the procuratorate, Humian, to review the case. After completing the criminal investigation, we would transfer it to the procuratorate for prosecution. As long as these two steps had no problems, this case would be considered over. We knew clearly that, after a long night, the father of the murderer Jiang Tao would take action. In reality, completing the evidence chain in just one night was the right decision. We discovered that Jiang Zhiquan had committed a crime but was not convicted. The reason was that he had caused a serious accident that injured people but was still exempted from prosecution thanks to the power of his family. This time, we tried to complete the chain of evidence as tightly as possible. The next morning, many powerful figures were present to try to intervene. However, after a whole night of trying, we made sure that he could not escape this crime. The evidence was undeniable and there was no chance of turning back. If everything had gone as planned and Jiang Zhiquan had been sentenced to death, this case might not have been worth mentioning. After the DNA comparison results were obtained, we finally breathed a sigh of relief. The DNA completely matched the physical traces left on the victim's body. With this undeniable evidence, the case could be considered closed. Lao Su and I also went to the hospital to visit Chen Ken and record his statement. After 2 days in the hospital, Chen Ken's spirit had improved, but the pain of loss was still evident. The only thing that helped him ease his mind was the thought that the murderer would be brought to justice. For example, he wished for the murderer to be executed. When answering the usual questions, Chen Ken mentioned his wife and daughter, describing every little memory about them in a choked voice. He and Duong Hu were classmates since college. They loved each other and overcame many difficulties to come together. In his eyes, Duong Hu was gentle, thoughtful, and the most beautiful woman in the world. Tran Trang was the most precious gift that God had given them, the little angel that brought happiness to the family. Lao Huck and I couldn't bear to interrupt. Chen Ken said that Zhang Tao had sent a lawyer to meet him and offered to compensate him $1 million, as long as he signed a non-litigation agreement. $1 million in 2005 was a huge amount of money, but Chen Ken angrily tore up the letter and chased them away. After telling the story, Chen Ken's tears kept falling, and he choked up and asked us, "Will the murderer be executed?" As investigators, we should not give our opinions on the final outcome, because that is the responsibility of the court. But at that moment, I could not help but reply, "The murderer will definitely pay with his life." After hearing that, Chen Ken nodded in despair and buried his head in tears. This feeling made us even more determined to handle the case seriously and quickly. Immediately afterwards, Xiao Lan reported that the prosecutor's office had completed its review and had submitted a prosecution to the court. During this time, we did not encounter any significant opposition. It seemed that everything was in order. However, what we did not expect was that problems arose during the trial phase. In normal criminal cases, the trial phase rarely encountered trouble. This time, we clearly saw how terrifying the power of money power was. Trial day. That afternoon, Xiao Lan hurried to see us, bringing us news that stunned us. Initially, based on the evidence collected by the investigation, Jiangxi's acts of breaking in, raping, and intentionally killing were obvious crimes that could not be denied. The method of committing the crime was barbaric and had a negative impact on society. The death sentence was completely reasonable. However, the defense attorney presented an unexpected piece of evidence. Jiang Zhiquan was not yet 18 years old. This was a real shock beyond expectations. We had Jiang Zhiquan's full household registration and ID card, proving that he was born in 1986, meaning that when the incident occurred in 2005, he was already 18 years old. However, the defense attorney presented documents showing that his household registration was delayed and that he was actually born in 1987. Due to a mistake from the community hospital, his age was initially recorded as 1987 instead of 1986. At that time, there were no computers, everything was stored on paper. The evidence includes documents from the community hospital proving the mistake and using various original documents to confirm that Jiang Zhiquan was indeed born in 1987. If this evidence is accepted, Zhang Zhiquan will be tried as a minor. Although suspects between the ages of 16 and 18 are still criminally responsible, the court can be lenient or reduce the sentence. In other words, if this evidence is established, Zhang Zhiquan will not be sentenced to death, but the maximum sentence may be only 20 years in prison. With his father's finances and power, Zhang Zhiquan could be freed in a few years. Jian immediately requested cross-examination of the evidence. According to Article 196 of the Criminal Procedure Code, if the court has doubts about the evidence, it can postpone the trial for further investigation. Lao Suk and I then asked to verify the accuracy of this evidence. Lao Suk and I immediately agreed, because we did not want to let this criminal go. But when Ha Lan left, Lao Suk and I looked at each other with concern. We knew that this would not be easy to resolve, because Jiang Tao must have arranged everything in advance. We predicted that it would be difficult to detect errors in that evidence, but surprisingly, this was just the beginning, and even the final verdict of this case was just the opening act of a more complicated chain of events. At that time, anything could happen. Next, things began to develop in an unpredictable direction. During that time, Lao Su and I went to the community hospital where Zhang Zhiquan was born countless times, patiently negotiating with Director Li Jianming, but they were really very careful. We did forensic examination of the evidence documents, but the ink and papers were actually from 20 years ago. The ink age recognition technology at that time only supported relative identification within 5 years, and could not identify handwriting that was 10 or 20 years old. Furthermore, some important documents were carbon copies, which were completely unauthentic. In any case, this was no longer important, because at the next trial, more unexpected details appeared. After the trial ended that day, Xiao Lan came to us, full of anger, and recounted the strange details of the trial. First of all, the big surprise was that Chen Ken suddenly presented a letter of withdrawal. This made me stunned, unable to believe it. I still remember his pained and determined expression when he talked about making the murderer pay for his life. I kept asking Xiao Lan with full of doubt, did Chen Ken really hand out a letter of dismissal? Xiao Lan answered firmly, yes. Not only that, he also publicly forgave the murderer at the trial. What happened to him? From what I knew, he might have been threatened. I said to Lao Suk, we need to find Chen Ken again immediately. But, Jian interrupted, wait, I have more things to tell. During the trial, Zhang Zhiquan shook off his silence and showed deep remorse. Not only did he admit his guilt, he even cried and apologized to Chen Ken, expressing his utmost remorse. But the most displeasing thing was that the defense attorney presented another piece of evidence. Zhang Zhiquan suffered from schizophrenia after a serious accident before. Dr. Tru Van Hao appeared and concluded that the injury from the accident had caused him to have a mental disorder, affecting his perception and behavior control. The defense attorney immediately asked Zhang Zhiquan, before committing the crime, did your mood fluctuate? He replied, yes. At that time I was very disappointed, but when I met that woman, I suddenly felt excited. The attorney continued to ask, do you remember what you did? He sighed, looking vague, I really don't remember clearly. At that time I was hot-tempered, I didn't know what I did. The attorney concluded, so, it is very possible that Zhang Zhiquan did not have self-control when committing the crime. Lao Suk and I looked at each other, stunned by the developments. Added to the reason of not being of age, along with mental illness, it is highly likely that he will not be held criminally responsible but will only be hospitalized for treatment. Xiao Lan lamented, the case was suspended for reinvestigation. If the situation continues like this, Zhang Zhiquan will likely only be detained in the hospital until he recovers. Hearing this, Lao Su laughed bitterly, didn't Dr. Zhao decide when he would recover? But Xiao Lan continued, resolute, if the situation doesn't improve in the next trial, I will request a reinvestigation. We only have 1 month to expose the defense's plot. It was clear that Xiao was determined to fight to the end. This was also the reason why he came to us in the first place, investigation was our strength. Lao Su also agreed immediately, okay, then we will wait for your news. Xiao Lan nodded. Our conversation ended here. At the same time, the real turning point of this case was finally coming. Before Xiaolan took action, I tried to contact Chen Ken many times, but he did not answer the phone. I wanted to know if he was under any pressure to give me that agreement letter. There's no way he would do this voluntarily. So I decided to go see him myself. But he wasn't home. After all, this was a murder scene, and he probably never wanted to come back. After several fruitless searches, I finally received a message from him: "Police, I'll continue to go to court. No need to contact outside of court." It was obvious that he knew why I was looking for him. He deliberately avoided me. I immediately texted back, "If you have any personal safety issues, please let me know immediately. I have an obligation to ensure that you are not forced." But the message he sent back was only, "I took the money." These 8 words shocked me again. I'd rather he be forced to sign the agreement than accept Zhang's mediation for money. Is this his way of convincing me to stop looking into it? However, it turned out that I thought too much. He just compromised and took the money. This case is coming to an end at a dizzying speed. The next trial went very smoothly, and finally, the judge announced that he would set a date for the verdict. Lao Su and I were both confused. We didn't know what happened in the trial, and I hadn't received any news from Xiaolan either. Finally, realizing that something was wrong, I decided to go to the prosecutor's office to see Xiaolan. At that time, he was sitting at his desk and said without looking up, "You don't need to continue pursuing Zhang Zhiquan's case." I asked in surprise, "What do you mean?" Xiaolan raised her head, looked at me with a strange gaze, and slowly said, "You don't need to do anything, just wait for the court's verdict." I still didn't understand. "So, what about the evidence?" Xiaolan replied, "Zhang Zhiquan has been examined by the court. He really has mental problems. Although it is difficult to accept, it is the truth. We must respect the truth and the law." I was even more confused. Xiaolan's expression in front of me was very stiff. I suddenly realized. It seemed that the power of money was even greater than I thought. But I still hoped and continued to ask, "Last time you said you wanted to follow through? There is still a chance, even after the verdict, we can still protest. We have 2 levels of trial, and the first result is not the final result." Xiaolan replied indifferently, "We will not object, and the prosecutor's office has also made a recommendation for sentencing." Of course. Maybe Xiaolan is like Chen Ken. At that time I only felt sad. And Xiaolan's cold voice made me lose all hope. "I also warn you, no one is allowed to continue the investigation." At that time I thought of Yang Hui lying on the bed in pain. I thought of Chen Zhuang, who was thrown away in a trash bag, her body bruised. They would probably never get justice. At that time I realized that sometimes, no matter how far the investigation went, no matter how perfect the chain of evidence was, and no matter how the suspect confessed in court, it still didn't matter. What happened at a higher level was like a curtain, and I didn't even know what really happened. But it was clear that in that era, the power of money always prevailed. I could only leave sadly. Not long after, I learned of the court's verdict. Zhang Zhiquan, innocent, was hospitalized for treatment. The entire case was completely closed. However, the surprising thing was that the story didn't end completely. About 2 months later, a person from the criminal investigation team came to report the incident. Jiang Tao. Yes, the richest man in the city, Jiang Tao, Zhang Zhiquan's father. Logically, with Jiang Tao's power, everything could have been resolved at a higher level than us. Just like Zhang Zhiquan's case, he never appeared before us during the whole process. But this time, he came to the criminal investigation team, sitting in front of me and Captain Chu. Moreover, he looked very haggard, no longer had the demeanor of a successful person. But he was still calm. The first sentence he said when reporting made us understand the reason. "My son is missing, he was kidnapped." Old Su blurted out, "Zhang Zhiquan?" Jiang Hao quickly replied, "Yes. He is in danger." Old Su and I looked at each other, knowing that something was wrong. As far as we know, Zhang Zhiquan should have been admitted to a mental hospital and was being treated. Lao Su immediately made a few phone calls and received the following news. First, Zhang Zhiquan was admitted to a mental hospital yesterday, but disappeared in the middle of the night. Someone suspicious was seen breaking into the hospital to avoid detection, and is suspected of being a kidnapper. Second, this mental hospital belongs to the city, not under our jurisdiction, so the case of Zhang Zhiquan's disappearance has been taken over by the city office for investigation. When Lao Su returned, he spread his arms and smiled, saying that the case had been handed over to the higher-ups and was no longer under our jurisdiction. We really didn't want to get involved in this matter any further. But things always change. Jiang Tao hurriedly said, I know, but I received this morning and found it in front of my house. He took out an envelope from his pocket with trembling hands and opened it for us to see. It was a photo of Zhang Zhiquan. Many photos captured Jiang Shi's various states. From a smug look, to crying, with many wounds on his face, and finally, his face was swollen and bruised to the point of being unrecognizable. A look of despair. Finally, there was a piece of paper attached to a piece of newspaper. Go to X district to report to the police, your son will be saved. District X is where we are, and where the first case happened. Old Sue and I looked at each other, full of suspicion. Why is it like this? Why would the kidnapper leave such a note? Old Sue read it, was stunned for a long time, then reluctantly said, wait a minute, we can't just interfere in this case. I need to contact the city office leader. Jiang Zhao hurriedly said, no, they caught the suspect last night. The person named Chen Ken is under investigation. We also informed him about the incident this morning. They might be on their way here. Old Sue was surprised again. Jiang Zhao's controllability was really strong. Then, Old Sue's phone rang. It was Captain Huang of the city's criminal investigation team. They were really coming. The problem is, there is still a doubt here. If Zhang Zhiquan's kidnapper was Chen Ken, he wouldn't be so easy to catch, right? But now he's in the hands of Captain Huang. If it's not him, is this a separate kidnapping, unrelated to the previous case? And what we're most concerned about is why did the kidnapper ask Jiang Tao to come back here to report to the police? Captain Huang's team came, bringing many people, and of course, Chen Ken was among them. Old Sue was a little annoyed that he had arrested someone in our jurisdiction without prior notice. Although the team's jurisdiction covered our area, this was not against the rules, but according to common sense, there should have been some communication with us. However, Captain Huang did not say much to us. It was obvious that he was also under pressure from his superiors. After arranging seats for Jiang Tao and Chen Ken, he quickly discussed the details of the incident with us. First of all, Zhang Zhiquan's disappearance last night was definitely a long-planned kidnapping. According to the investigation at the scene, they found that the other party left very few traces. Only a few cameras recorded their escape from the hospital. In the photo, a strong man carrying the unconscious Zhang Zhiquan sneaked out from the back door of the hospital, where surveillance was lax. That is to say, the kidnapper is very familiar with the hospital's internal affairs, most likely an insider who committed the crime, and another colleague is investigating the matter. Secondly, Chen Ken has a perfect alibi. When the incident happened at the hospital last night, he really played mahjong with some colleagues all night. After hearing this, I frowned. At that time, I even suspected that his suffering was all fake. Perhaps he was really a fraud in the first place. However, could such a cruel act of killing his wife and daughter be truly forgiven? This is what makes me extremely conflicted. Captain Huang continued to keep Chen Ken, because these two cases happened too close together. Even if Chen Ken is not really the culprit, we still need to investigate whether he is involved in any way. But what confused us the most was the letter Jiang Tao received this morning. Not to mention the photos, what did the contents of that note mean? We discussed for a long time without any results. This note seemed like a condition, but it actually pointed to a location. That was the place where the tragic case of Chen Ken's wife and daughter occurred. Furthermore, this type of kidnapping without ransom was extremely rare. The possibility of revenge was very high. Therefore, everyone agreed that this kidnapping could be related to the previous case. Therefore, we agreed to expand the scope of the search. The kidnapper and Zhang Zhiquan were most likely hiding in this district. We quickly made a plan and organized our personnel to begin the search. Old Su and I went to find Chen Ken. Compared to 2 months ago, Chen Ken looked thinner and more haggard. However, his face was very calm, his eyes were bright. As soon as he sat down, Old Su asked directly, "Tell me the truth, does Zhang Zhiquan's matter have anything to do with you?" Chen Ken smiled. His answer stunned us all. "I hope that bastard dies every day, do you think that's important?" At this moment, the feeling of unease rose even more strongly. If what he said now was true, then why did he accept the money and sign the agreement in the first place? Old Su paused, emphasizing the question, "I'm not talking about that guy, but about last night's matter. Was it you who did it?" Chen Ken didn't answer, but instead said, "I want to talk directly to Jian Tao." This request was completely unexpected. Chen Ken's eyes suddenly became intense, gritting his teeth and saying, "I knew that someone higher up would be involved in this matter, so from last night until now I haven't said a word. I dare to make this request to you, because you have seen what my wife and daughter have become." At that moment, I suddenly realized, it turned out that Chen Ken had planned it all along. His hatred was real, his intention of revenge was real, but his words of confession and acceptance were all fake. Even playing mahjong last night was just to create an alibi. I also understood why this kidnapping case did not have a ransom or any unreasonable demands on Jian Tao. If Chen Ken made a request to Captain Huang, there would be no response. If he revealed any information about the kidnapping, he would definitely be imprisoned until he told the whole story. Making a request? That was unthinkable. Chen Ken's bloodshot eyes were filled with indignation. He suppressed his anger and said, "Do you know? My wife and daughter's case has been going on for a long time, but I have never met Zhang Tao. I never heard him say sorry. I completely believe this. After all, Zhang is a big shot. None of the investigators on our team have ever met Zhang Tao, and it seems that a member of the victim's family is not important enough to catch his eye. Chen Ken is really looking for revenge. But the question is, who is helping him?" Old Su was silent for a moment, perhaps he was thinking the same as me. "I can promise you, but you have to tell us where Zhang Zhiquan is and who your accomplices are." Chen Ken bowed his head slightly and replied, "There are no conditions for negotiation. If you don't agree, then forget it." Old Su frowned, then fell silent again. In this state, Chen Ken was like a lion suppressing his anger. His anger had never been extinguished. Tolerance was impossible, so what was the purpose of making such a commitment? Suddenly, I had a very bold guess. But I couldn't say it. After leaving the interrogation room, Old Su still hadn't made a decision, so he had to discuss it with Captain Huang. As for me, I went out immediately. I went to the prosecutor's office. At that time, Xiao Lan was still sitting in the office, silently processing the documents in her hand. I sat down in front of him and quickly recounted the whole story from last night to today. He listened attentively, not saying a word. Seeing him so calm, I couldn't help but be confused, asking, "Don't you find it strange?" Lan rarely smiled, and replied, "I've witnessed even stranger things, like murder and killing of infants under 1 year old, and the person was still innocent. At that time I was pressed down on this chair, unable to do anything. So now it's fine. I don't even intend to leave." That's right. There really was someone above him who suppressed Lan, asking him to obediently complete the case. Lan, I can guess. I sighed and slowly said what I had guessed. From the beginning to the end, Chen Ken wanted Zhang Zhiquan to die. His request has always been a death sentence for Zhang Zhiquan. Even when Jian Tao hired a lawyer and offered a huge compensation, he still did not budge. But why did his attitude change completely after the first trial? Because in that trial, the other side used the evidence of Zhang Zhiquan is not yet 18 years old to attack. This completely frightened Chen Ken. Everyone knew that if this evidence was accepted, Zhang Zhiquan could not be sentenced to death. So Chen Ken thought of another way. Because he never changed his original intention, his only request was Jiang Shijuan's death. Nothing else. So I came to the conclusion, about Chen Ken's real motive, either he is sentenced to death, or he is acquitted so he can handle it himself. Xiao Lan smiled and asked, if Jiang Shijuan is compensated and pardoned, will he be cleared of his guilt? Of course not. We still have to supplement the evidence of mental illness that the other side brought up in the second trial. Xiao Lan asked, isn't it impossible? Chen Ken can't control this, right? I continued to explain, Jiang Zhao never thought of using mental illness to defend Jiang Shijuan. If he had, he would have brought it up in the first trial. It is unreasonable to introduce new evidence in 2 consecutive trials. There must be someone manipulating it. Someone, after the first trial was postponed, advised Jiang Zhao to fabricate evidence of mental illness. That person must be very important. I continued, sentence by sentence, if Chen Ken could really do it and encourage Jiang Zhao to fabricate evidence of mental illness during the postponement, would this be reasonable? After the first trial, when he learned that Jiang Shijuan could not be executed, he began to look for another way. And that way is to have Jiang Shijuan declared innocent. So what happened last night? Jiang Shijuan was kidnapped as soon as he entered the hospital, because the kidnappers had been prepared for the past 2 months, just waiting to act. Xiao Lan listened to me quietly, her face expressionless, only asking softly, how is that possible? This is not a joke. Could Chen Ken have predicted which hospital Jiang Shijuan would be sent to for treatment? I replied, you have the right to request a decision on the sentence, so you can advise the judge on where Jiang Shijuan will be sent. If it weren't for this happening now, no one would have paid attention to this small detail. This is why Xiao Lan suddenly changed his attitude in the second trial and did nothing more. Because he already knew everything, because he couldn't do anything more. Perhaps because he hoped someone would take action. Xiao Lan smiled and said, your imagination is rich, but it's best not to mention things that have no evidence. After all, we all work based on evidence, right? I couldn't help but laugh at myself. Jiang Shijuan's evidence is convincing, but isn't it just fabrication? Hearing this, Xiao Lan frowned and asked me, what do you want in the end? You don't intend to save Jiang Shijuan, do you? I also asked him a question. I don't want to save him, I'm just thinking, if a person is extremely deserving of death, and I have the perfect motive to kill him, should I kill him? Xiao Lan shook her head and replied, I know the answer is no, but you're standing there talking without feeling any back pain. If this happened to you, you would pull out a gun and kill that person on the spot. I was speechless. What if I were Chen Ken? I can't even imagine. Finally, Ha Lan revealed the real reason why he got involved in this case. I just want the punishment to be applied for its intended purpose. Punishment can only be punishment, it can't have any other meaning. This is the most basic justice in my heart.